Hey everyone, Tim. Thank you for joining us for our first NIL Office Hours session. I appreciate you taking time out of your day to join us. I am Luke Bonner, founder and CEO at Power Forward. I have a long background pushing for reform in college athletics myself, dating back to when I was a very mediocre basketball player at the University of Massachusetts and doing behind the scenes work with the National College Players Association around several of the cost of attendance gap lawsuits that were happening back in the day, all the way up through attempting to unionize college athletes with the College Athletes Players Association. And now I find myself at the helm of Power Forward, which is an athlete to consumer marketplace that's really out to allow athletes to take ownership of their own brands, which also kind of lands me ironically square in the center of NIL. So today's first guest, I've been getting a lot of questions from college athletes and from family members. There's been, a lot of chaos, frankly, and confusion around NIL. So we thought we would start having these sessions to try to give some guidance. But full disclosure, this is just guidance. This is not like legal advice or anything like that. If you're interested in learning more, diving deeper, you can all find us on the internet. It's 2021, and we are happy to help kind of steer any questions that you may have. Without further ado, I'd like to welcome Tim Nevius. Tim, I would love just quick intro background on yourself. It's super fascinating. I think everyone would like to get that overview before we get started.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks for having me, Luke. And, don't sell yourself short on the college playing career and professional playing career too. My own college baseball career was much less celebrated. My role was as basically a late game infielder for defensive purposes, and I got put in the game to bunt and pinch run, and then occasionally I was put in the game to actually get hit by a pitch. So not exactly the most celebrated college baseball experience, but it was still wonderful nonetheless. My name's Tim Nevius, and I'm an attorney and a former NCAA investigator. After playing baseball, I worked at the NCAA for 5 years in the enforcement department, and it was my job to travel around to college campuses across the country and help enforce the rule book against coaches, schools, athletes, etc. I saw the light eventually and switched sides. I left the NCAA. I joined Winston & Strawn, a firm here in New York City, helped initiate the litigation that became the Alston litigation, and helped lead that for a couple years before it went to trial, before it went to the Supreme Court, which we heard a decision on last month. So worked with the attorneys on that case, as well as through the National College Players Association, so indirectly with Luke. And then also started my own practice then in the meantime, advising college athletes and families on NCAA rules and everything related to college sports. So, and in addition to that, started a nonprofit that is called the College Athlete Advocacy Initiative. It's designed to advocate for reform and support college athletes and their representation rights. So that's my background, and I've participated in these reform efforts, including at the state and federal level with respect to name, image, and likeness litigation, as well as health and safety and other things.
I mean, that's an incredible background. That's why, I was happy to get you in the mix on this. I guess real quick, there's a lot of, I think, lazy headlines that are causing a lot of confusion, right? I mean, we saw it last year, when the NCAA announced that they were going to consider reforming NIL policy, right? And then all of a sudden there's big, Instagram posts on Bleacher Report and things like that that say college athletes can get paid, right? That's all you see. And that's what 500,000 people like, and that's what they leave with, which, obviously you and I know that wasn't actually the case. And now we're at a point where there is interim policy in place. There are different laws in different states. Do you want to just walk through kind of high level, what is the current status on name, image, and likeness with the NCAA and in the country?
Yeah, sure. So just to clarify, and I know a lot of people already know this, but we'll start at a lower level, or I guess I should say a high level, and then work down to more specifics. Stick with us. And when people have questions, obviously we would encourage that, because we want to know what is concerning people the most. But name, image, and likeness, it's the right to your own name, image, and likeness. It's the right of publicity that you have to consent to the use of your images, your name, your likeness, and receive payment for that. And so in college sports, these are rights that everyone enjoys except for college athletes, basically, and they're restricted by NCAA rules. And so recently, in the last couple of years, starting with the Fair Play to Play Act in California, states started to enact legislation that will allow college athletes these rights despite NCAA rules to the contrary. And so the pressure built, and we finally got to the point where July 1st, these rights started going into effect. And the current state is that the NCAA basically capitulated. They gave in and said, all right, any school that exists in a state that has an existing name, image, and likeness law, you have to follow those laws. And so the athletes at those schools in those states are subject to the laws applicable in their states. Importantly, every state law is a little bit different. And so you need to understand the law that applies in your state. Some state laws have already gone into effect, and others go into effect later this year or next year or even after that. That might change. In the meantime, if you're at an NCAA school in a state that doesn't have a state law, so for instance, one of my clients is going to a school in Massachusetts. That's which Luke, you know well, and that's a state that does not yet have a name, image, and likeness bill. Therefore, the NCAA has effectively said we're going to waive the application of the rules that typically prohibit these rights, and it's up to the schools to set guidelines that govern these activities. And so everything then just defaults to whatever the school says the guidelines are. And so that's why it's important to understand not only what applies in your state, but what applies at your school. In the meantime, there's conversation related to potential federal legislation that perhaps could apply a uniform rule across the country. But until that time, the regulation is going to default to the states and the schools. So I'll leave it at that, Luke, but I have some other thoughts in terms of...
So are there any schools at the moment where you theoretically could be in a state that doesn't have a law, and you actually don't have any sort of right of publicity? Like, does that exist anywhere right now, or has every school adopted a policy? Do you know?
I'm not aware. I mean, so there's 1,100 colleges and universities in the NCAA alone, and this is across all three divisions that the NCAA has basically said we're going to, defer to the schools and states that don't have a state law. I haven't heard of any schools that are saying, hey, we're not going to allow any name, image, and likeness activities, but there are schools in states that don't have a law that are restricting them more than others. So they may impose conditions upon, what you can and can't do with respect to name, image, and likeness.
So for any athlete who wants to kind of engage in activities, around, any sort of, not just enterprise, but we talk a lot on our team about, like, NIL isn't just getting paid, right? It's also promoting something or getting credit for work, right? If you're, our company released a video a couple weeks ago that featured a college basketball player that, she went and got clearance through her compliance department to appear in it. And, it's not like a paid thing or anything, but even just being able to associate with an external brand, that's like brand new, right? That didn't exist. So a logical starting point from what you're saying really is, talk to someone, an administrator at your school. Is that like the best route at the moment? Or like, even where do you even find information about, your state law right now today?
Yeah, exactly. And so I think you have to start at the school level. Here's a couple things to keep in mind. First, know who your compliance director is. Now, they are sort of overwhelmed at the moment because this was sort of sprung upon them. They expected that there would be more specific NCAA rules and guidance on this. But in general, there's no need to rush right now. The rush should just be to understand what applies to you, so you don't do anything that would harm your eligibility or your value to your brand. But yeah, start with the compliance office and work from there. Understand what rules apply to you both at your state and at your school. With respect to name, image, and likeness, there's sort of two basic components. One is that you can engage in these activities, basically receive money for endorsements and things of that nature. And two, you can have representation. And those are two separate things, but the representation includes representation by an agent for marketing purposes, or a brand manager or an attorney, and people, what they're calling professional service providers. Those are two separate things. And then importantly, something that I sort of skipped over, Luke, is that we don't yet have complete guidance as to how this applies to high school athletes. And so the NCAA has indicated that, and the likelihood is that if high school athletes engage in these activities, there's not going to be any impact on their NCAA eligibility. However, maintaining their high school eligibility is another question, and it depends on what association governs the school that you play for in that state. So you have to pay attention to high school rules if you have yet to enter into college as well.
So on the representation side, what is do you have any advice on how to go about securing a legitimate representative? I know this is like a brand new industry segment in sports, right? So there's all sorts of new businesses popping up, or people on the other side who see opportunity around athletes before they make it to the pro level. Is there I guess like what are the things you need to keep in mind? Like, how do you even tell if someone's a legit rep or not? Like, I know college athletes are getting contacted by all sorts of people, and it's hard to tell like who's legit and who's not.
Yeah, that's right. There's a lot of people that want to be involved in this space because it's exciting. They think that there's a money-making opportunity as a representative if they're working with athletes. And so the first thing is to work with people that you trust. If you don't know who to trust, start with every agent needs to be certified by both the state and by the school. And so again, at the school level, they should have a list of agents that are registered with your school. You can start there. The state registrations are harder to sort of find on your own, but you can, from a starting point, if somebody reaches out to you, just ask them, can you tell me all the states that you're registered in as an agent? And if they say, well, I don't have to be registered as an agent, that's probably not the case. You do have to be registered as an agent. And the term agent is very broad. It applies to not just people that function in a traditional agent capacity, for instance, with an agency like a CAA or a Clutch or a Rock Nation. Those are your traditional sports agencies, and there's several of them. But it also applies to people that work for instance, companies that help facilitate influencer marketing and brand managers, and anyone effectively that is representing you to brands or other individuals for contracting and marketing purposes. They would qualify as an agent. So if anyone says, I don't have to be registered, the question would be, well, why is that? And you might just say, I may feel more comfortable working with someone who is registered. Now, there's a difference between someone who's representing you to a brand or a company to secure a contract for you and an attorney, someone that's giving you advice on the terms of a contract and not necessarily trying to secure deals on your behalf or negotiate deals on your behalf, but actually just advising you as to the rules and regulations that apply to you, plus what you should be concerned about in terms of the terms that apply in any contract that's proposed to you. And that's separate. Attorneys have their own registration that they have to go through, which is to be licensed in a particular state to advise clients. So that's just something to keep in mind.
So one thing I think, like, this is where it does get a little complicated, even because a lot of agents, even at the professional level, you have to be registered, right, in whatever state you're operating. But I would say most agents don't just proactively, get registered across the board. That's just like typically not how you work, right? As you're kind of like negotiating with a client and about to sign them, then you get registered once you know where your clients are going to be located. So I would say that at the professional level, at least that's pretty common. So if you are talking to an agent that you like and that seems legit and all these things, and they're not registered in your state, do you think it's like okay to continue to verbalize and kind of proceed with that, but with the understanding that you cannot sign on officially until that agent actually gets registered at the school and in the state? Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. And it depends on the regulations in the state that apply to athlete agents, because in some states you can't actually make contact with the athlete until you've notified the school. There's a variety of laws that apply right now that are inconsistent with what the new name, image, and likeness rules, and so they haven't been updated yet. But to your point, yes, there may be agents that say, hey, listen, I'm a certified agent, or I'm getting certified, and I'm not yet registered in your state, but my registration is pending, or I'm submitting that information. Then you can check with the school. You can note, in fact, there's obligations in certain states for the athlete, although they're not often aware of it. You would find this out through compliance, to notify the school that you may be working with an agent and who that agent is. So you can always check with the school to say, this person reached out to me. I asked about their certification. It sounds like they're in the process of getting certified with the school. But as a starting point, the athlete or the agent can reach out to the athlete's school and just say, hey, I'm interested in working with the athlete at your school, and I just want to make sure I'm following the rules. Do you have school an agent certification process I need to follow, as well as any state registration that I have to follow? And it's bureaucratic in some respects, but it doesn't take that long necessarily to get registered and certified.
Yeah, I mean, so along those lines, the way the sports talent representation industry has existed, right, and has grown, for most agencies, right, the anchor is typically around that league or team contract as like a baseline, kind of like from like a economic standpoint. Most college athletes, I'm assuming, aren't necessarily going to, attract an agent, so to speak, not necessarily, right? So what do you do if you're an athlete that, wants to engage in these activities, but like you really don't have an avenue to secure a true agent? Do you need an agent? Even like, what are your kind of thoughts on that front? Like, how do you navigate this without a representative?
Yeah, it's challenging because you'll have to either serve as your own representative, or work with someone that is able to provide you with some advice and guidance. So start with parents and family, of course, but knowing that not everyone has the experience to advise on the terms of a contract, for instance. Speak with compliance about what resources may be available to you in case they are able to refer you to a list of representatives that aren't perhaps traditional big sports agents, but that are attorneys or service providers that can help you with certain needs. But yeah, there's right now, there's a lot of people and families that are sort of just representing themselves and engaging in conversations with brands. Brands are reaching out to them directly. And I would always encourage someone, to the extent that they're able to do this, to at least contact a lawyer. And it could be somebody locally, somebody that through friends or family, just so there's somebody who can at least put their eyes on the terms of contracts being proposed to you, so that there's at least some consistency with or some compliance with what the regulations are that may apply to you. Here's a couple things to keep in mind, though. Any name, image, and likeness activities, contracts, are likely to be have to be disclosed to the school. So there's state law and there's school policy that requires that to be any contracts to be provided to the school. They disclosed to the school. some schools in some states require that those contracts be disclosed in advance of you signing an agreement. So it's some level of protection potentially that someone is looking at that contract, but importantly, the compliance officers cannot advise on the terms of the contract or help you negotiate that contract. They may give you, some tips here and there, but ultimately their role is to just ensure that the contract is compliant with NCAA rules, school policy, and state law, as opposed to whether or not it's a good deal for you or it's not.
So if a company approaches you and offers you something and you're interested in it, I remember being a college athlete, like the financial realities of that life are challenging. And so someone offers you something, it sounds like best course of action is like right now, while I might disagree with this to some extent, but you're always better off disclosing this information to compliance. Is that correct? Like basically do that first before doing anything?
Yeah. So I would say not before anything, but yeah, there is a reason why you may want to, if a contract has been proposed to you, you submit that contract to compliance and say, I'm disclosing this, and either you have or haven't signed it. Now, compliance will tell you, and hopefully they're holding these education sessions. Schools are publishing their NIL policies. You'll know then based on those policies whether you have to disclose contracts in advance of signing them or within a period of time after signing them. And so defer to, school policy first. A lot of schools have third-party providers or apps or platforms or software by which they are disclosed. You use to disclose the terms of the contract that are you're as an athlete that you're engaging in, and so that's something to keep an eye on as well. In terms of and Luke, please jump in or ask me if there's another question here. But if you are working, first understand your resources on campus. Understand what you have, and whether or not somebody can refer you to resources off campus too. But then if you're, a lot of people are excited about this opportunity. I'm excited. This is great. Finally, athletes have the ability to engage in these rights like everyone else has had the opportunity to do. But be careful, be patient, and just proceed cautiously. Here's a few things to keep in mind. Everyone gets excited and they think about, what do I get out of this contract? This is what's being offered to me, whether it's free merchandise or, free meals or discounts or money, and in exchange for what? So that's the question. There's three things there that people don't often think about on the front end that they should, because they're thinking too much about, what do I get out of this? Which is fine. That's normal. But here's three things to think about. One, what do I owe in exchange? Because that's going to affect your value. It's also going to affect your time and effort and impose obligations on you that you have to fulfill for the duration of the contract, which leads to the second point. How long is this contract? You want to know, when does this contract terminate? Is there a renewal period, for instance? Some contracts have to terminate at the end of your eligibility or before. And you don't want to sign a deal that you think is great because of what you're getting out of it if the duration of the contract is effectively for your entire college career. And then you think, wow, that actually diminishes the value of this contract because of all the obligations I owe over the term of this contract. And then third is, how do I get out of it, which is related to the termination. But there are cancellation provisions, termination provisions, and things like that, that if the term of the contract is for 2 years or 3 years, something like that, there may be a separate provision that allows you to cancel it during the term of the contract for specific reasons or with a certain amount of notice, and you should keep an eye on that. And if it doesn't exist, then you may have that conversation with them to say, hey, if things aren't really going that well, or if there's a change in how things are working in our relationship, I'd like to have the opportunity to potentially get out of this agreement. Is that something we can talk about? And so those are things on the front end that you should really know and think about, because everyone just looks at, what do I get out of this, without necessarily considering What do I owe? When does it end? And how do I get out?
Yeah. So, I mean, my background, when I transitioned out of playing basketball, I worked in advertising and ran a sports marketing firm and did a lot of like influencer type of marketing and stuff like that. And what I'm seeing with college athletes I'm talking to now is, I mean, there's a very rudimentary understanding for the most part of these things, right? Like when you're 20 years old, like when I was in college, I had never heard of what a service level agreement was, for example, right? Until I was a professional working in this world. And just like an understanding on how like this sort of thing typically plays out is you usually start with like an offer sheet, right? So that's not a contract. You kind of map out so you should always ask for, I think, like an offer sheet that's written out in layman's terms, right? You're going to get paid this. When are you going to get paid this? What do you have to do to get paid, the money? And then once you agree to like an offer sheet, you usually take that and build out a contract. And so this like can help get you as an athlete gain kind of efficiency. If you're leaning on like a lawyer friend or someone that's going to look at this, if you have an offer sheet that explicitly kind of lays out in layman's terms what it is you think you're signing up for, and then you can kind of layer that over what the actual contract says, right? Like that's kind of key. And one thing I know that like on the power forward agreements with college athletes, one key provision I think that is super easy, like for even professionals to overlook that Tim, you called out, is even on like the fact that NIL regulations are liquid right now, right? This is not like a permanent setup like the current, like the way things are. So you need to make sure, right, you're not potentially exposing yourself to breach of contract or damages if the rules change outside of your control and you can no longer deliver upon the contract you've signed. So can you speak a little bit just about like that piece of it? Like where are we at in terms of like how permanent NIL is, and what like that provision specifically, like what you're referring to that I think probably every college athlete should have in any deal you do right now, right?
Yeah, and I'll ask you to elaborate on that provision in particular, Luke, but in terms of just the permanence of NIL, in general, it's here to stay. I think that we can all agree that, the athletes have gotten to this point, they've achieved these rights, and I don't see them going away at any point, anytime soon. The parameters of those rights may change. I would expect those parameters to trend towards more permissive, meaning the types of activities that you can engage in, if they're restricted in certain states or at certain schools right now, it's likely that those will continue to trend towards more permissive, if only because schools and states want to keep up with competitors so they don't lose recruits to other schools or states. And there is a possibility that there's some uniformity that applies across the board with respect to NIL activities if there's a federal piece of legislation, but we shouldn't count on that. And so you should continue to pay attention to what applies at your school and in your state. But yes, there are things that are subject to change in terms of the content of the contract. Then you can account for that. Here's an example too, and it's a little bit different than that. But for instance, if there are obligations that apply in a contract that you sign, obligations that you have, for instance, to make an appearance or to engage in to film a commercial or do a photo shoot or something along those lines. You shouldn't allow that to, and in fact, we should have started with this probably, is that don't allow these things to interfere with your primary obligations, which is to go to school and perform in your sport. Because without those things, if you don't perform in school, you're not going to be eligible to perform in your sport. If you can't perform in your sport, your profile is likely diminished, and therefore you probably don't have as much value to begin with in the first place. So take care of those things first. With that in mind, if there's a name, image, and likeness contract presented to you that calls for you to do things during team activities, that's not permissible. Keep in mind, too, that, and most athletes know this, is that their schedules are oftentimes in great flux and aren't even sent out to them by the coaching staff until like the week before. sometimes a couple days before, or it's subject to change. And if you have a commitment, in a contract that then all of a sudden is overridden by a team activity that was rescheduled for a last minute notice or something, you don't want to put yourself in a position where, because you didn't engage in the required activity under the contract, all of a sudden you've breached that contract. So there has to be some flexibility that's permitted in these contracts to account for the life and the schedule of a college athlete.
Yeah, I've been thinking about that a lot recently. Right now we're in summertime, right? For most, at least like most of the sports are off, right? So you have a little bit more flexibility in that. But it's going to be, just like very interesting, I think, like athlete wide, when you get into this realm of working around your schedules. Because again, like you said, this isn't when we're talking on like the endorsement side, it's like you're never getting anything for free, right? That's like saying you get a free education for playing your sport. You don't. You get the education, you get your school paid for because you play the sport. It's the same thing here. So I'm just curious. I'm really curious to see what's going to happen as athletes start to learn what their time can be worth. And then you're going to have to miss opportunities because of demands from your team and your university and all that stuff. It could lead to a broader, I think, like labor movement. Frankly, is my thinking. But another piece to this, just want to, as we got a few more minutes here, but we've been speaking a lot in terms of more just like company comes to you and offers you a deal. You and I know like name, image, and likeness isn't just about those endorsements, those like influencer deals. Like just because you have NIL doesn't mean every college athlete has to go out and try to be an Instagram influencer now, right? That's not all this is. How does this all apply to anyone just like starting any sort of entrepreneurial endeavor? Like you could start a podcast, you can run training sessions, you can run a camp, you could do charity events, like all these things that didn't exist before, right? Like you couldn't associate your name with it because you didn't have the rights to it. Is there anything that anyone who's not interested in a brand deal or something needs to keep in mind as they maybe just try to exist and create their own business?
It's a great point. And there are a variety of ways in which you can use your name, image, and likeness now beyond being a social media influencer or engaging in traditional brand endorsements and things of that nature. And I would say that for everyone, I agree with your point. It's like, resist that pressure to sort of be an influencer or grow your following or whatever it is. Do it with awareness and consciousness and with a purpose. In fact, let me say this: you are now the CEO of your own brand and business, or at least you have the opportunity to be. And so, in doing that, you may actually write down a business plan, and as part of that business plan, outline your values. As part of those values, articulate what your goal is in engaging in these activities. Don't do it just because now the opportunity's here and I feel like I'm missing out, that sort of thing. Pay attention to what you need to focus on first, school and sports, and understand that efforts to engage in brand deals, you don't want to overextend yourself. You just don't want to put yourself in that situation because it's gonna backfire. So think long term as opposed to short term. Don't be too influenced by everyone else around you and what they're doing. Focus on what you need to do. In terms of opportunities beyond social media and endorsements, you can start your own business. You can be an entrepreneur now. You can, some of these things existed with qualifications in the past, but now you can put your name on a basketball camp or a football camp or a tennis camp or whatever it is that you're engaged in and make money off of that. You can now sell your work product. So, for instance, there's a former client of mine who's a basketball player that makes these incredible paintings, and until recently has been unable to sell them under his name online, and now he can do that. Another client of mine who's a tennis player that is a talented musician as well and has a Spotify channel, but just as recently as a few months ago was told he had to take his name and his picture off of that Spotify channel because it was monetized. So he was getting money for each stream of his songs. You can do that now. And the same is with respect to, like you said, podcasts or your YouTube channels or videos. there's a variety of ways in which now you can start your own business, be your own CEO, and engage in these activities using your own name, image, and likeness that are separate and apart from being a brand ambassador, a social media influencer, etc.
Yeah, you also have the ability now, right, to ask for compensation for your time, which hasn't existed before. And I think a lot of athletes would be surprised to learn, what that really means. That doesn't mean you have to get paid for everything you do. But when I was in college, I would get asked to go speak at different things all the time. And having the ability, you always want to say yes, and you're kind of conditioned to say yes as a college athlete. You're kind of conditioned to think you owe the community something back for being in your position. But understanding that, that starting to understand the value of your time and how empowering it is to even just like ask if there's an appearance fee or there's any sort of budget. Maybe you get a car service and lunch out of it instead, but like it never hurts to ask, and it's okay to ask for those things because, whenever you're, going to an event or something, there's budgets to those things. There's people working, and you're no different, right? And you can still do it if they say there's no budget or whatever. That's totally fine. Like everyone makes decisions, but I would highly recommend that. And then one point I think I really like that you just made was around don't worry about kind of like everyone else around you right now, and try to ignore. There's a lot of companies and press trying to pinpoint what is NIL worth, right? And it's a lot of made up stuff. You have to think to yourself, right? Like if someone wants you to do something, ask yourself, what is this worth to me? Do I want to do it for the amount of money they're offering me? And if it feels good to you, then do it, right? That's all that matters right now. And so I would just caution any sort of numbers you see online of dollar signs attached to what you're worth, because what you're worth is whatever you can make is ultimately what we've been saying. But Tim, it's been super great to have you. Any last words on the subject? Any recommendations for if anyone's having questions, recommendations for who to reach out to, where to turn? If you want to talk to someone independent of a university, I understand having skepticism on that front as an athlete too.
Yeah.
But would love to just let you finish. Take us away into the sunset with some last words here.
Well, I will say, I'll just pick up on one of the points that you mentioned, related to, for instance, you're talking about appearances, and it's a great point to just say that's an opportunity now that exists. Appearances, to speak, to sign autographs, things of that nature. And yes, certainly inquire about, what is available to be provided to me in exchange for that. But keeping in mind that what you cannot do is be paid for your performance on the field. So anything that calls for payment as a result of your performance or achievement as an athlete is not permitted, and so you have to be aware of that. Same is true with respect to any. Do
you have an example of that? Where that would be an issue?
Sure. I mean, basically anything that says if you come to UMass, we're going to pay you as a company to, we're going to pay you $50,000 or whatever it is, and you have to just do a couple brand endorsements on your social media channels. But it's contingent upon you enrolling at UMass. That's one thing. The other is if you come to UMass and you win Player of the Year, that's up for debate, but that seems to be contingent upon your performance as an athlete, and so you can't be paid to perform as an athlete because that would be considered a services agreement in which what you're providing is you're actually engaged in your athletics, as opposed to endorsing a product or putting your name and image on something that's like a business of your own. So that's just something to keep in mind. The compliance officers are well aware of that, and that's something that they're going to be tracking on quite a bit. In terms of resources, it's really hard because I would start with who do you have in your circle, and then who do you have at your school? And I understand the skepticism sometime of working, perhaps it depends on the relationship of, individuals at the school, but start with the people you know and trust. There will be more and more people entering into this area to provide services to athletes, and then it's just a matter of who can you trust based on their credentials, their background, and what they get out of it too. And don't be afraid to ask, what's in this for you in working with me.
Yeah, that's a great point. Find an advocate on campus. I know for me, I was able to identify a couple faculty members who were very influential, kind of on that I could talk to about, not even NIL, just like issues, with college athletics in general and stuff we were going through on the team. Always great to have, a faculty, advocate. I would say I highly recommend that if you can identify one. Well, Tim, is really great to have you here. We're going to be doing this again throughout the summer. We've got other guests lined up, focused in different areas, not just like NIL experts, but folks who touch the different pieces of this to provide some insight. We'll be putting these out for anyone who missed it, and we're excited to keep these going. I'm going to stop recording right now. If you are interested, we'll hang out for a couple more minutes. There's a chat window on the right. If you would like to submit any questions there, that'll be off the record at this point. We're happy to, have Tim hang out and answer a few more questions while he's here.